But there is a different view. The view I'm going to show you now is the way this material is classically taught in most seminaries. And as a result, most pastors, I'll show you some exciting exceptions, but I'm talking about conservative pastors now. I'm talking about the general run-of-the-mill pastors. They talk about Genesis 6 in terms of what's called the line of Seth. And the view is that the sons of God, that phrase, refers to Seth, the leadership of Seth. They paint this picture. Abel's been killed by Cain, right? Then there comes Seth. Well, Cain's the bad guy, Seth's the good guy, is the fabric they try to create. And the sons of God is a phrase, they argue, that refers to the Sethite leadership. By the way, there's not a scrap of biblical reference that supports this. This is just the way it's taught. The daughters of Adam really means the daughters of Cain. And the big mistake that was made, presumably, is that the Sethite leadership commingled with the daughters of Cain, and that was supposed to be a no-no. And there's some problems with that. The sin in this was a failure to maintain separation. There's a problem with this because separation isn't called for until chapter 11. They weren't told to keep separate, by the way, so this is all very contrived. But even when you go through this, the other question is, well then, fine, if you got believers and unbelievers marrying, who are these Nephilim? When a believer and an unbeliever get married and have children, the children turn out to be monsters, but they're not monstrous. They're not genetically distinctive. You with me? You see the difference? These Nephilim are genetically distinctive. And this whole idea of the line of Seth emerged in the 5th century. Celsus and Julian the Apostate used the traditional belief of the angel view of Genesis 6 to attack Christianity, because it's a weird idea. A lot of people rebel at this idea. Angels having, it's just unpleasant. So a guy by the name of Julius Africanus resorted to the Sethite theory as a more comfortable way with dealing with the text. He contrived this idea, well, what it really means is this, It doesn't mean what it says, it means that it's really referring to such and so. And of course, then Cyril of Alexandria used it to repudiate the Orthodox position, because leaning on Africanus. But the real mistake came when Augustine embraced the Sethite view, and because he did, and because of his stature, it became the Orthodox view. The lines of Seth is the view that's, even to this day, still taught about this passage. And thus it became part of the Catholic Church, and it prevailed through the Middle Ages. And most Protestant denominations that derive from the Reformation they dragged this baggage along without re-examining it. And so it's commonly taught today. When I'm teaching you here, you're going to have to do some digging to even come across what's called the angel view of Genesis 6. But the text itself, the sons of God is never used of believers in the Old Testament. That's what the Sethite view would require. Seth was not God, Cain was not Adam. These were daughters of Adam, not daughters of Cain, right? So forth. And there's no mention of daughters of Elohim. There's sons of God, but are there no daughters of Elohim? What's the point? And there's also some grammatical problems with that I won't bore you with. That gets technical, so we'll move on. And the lines were separated in Genesis 11. That's when that was imposed upon Isaac, not for Ishmael or anybody else, just on Isaac. By the way, if the Sethites were the good guys, right? That's the theory of the Seth view. Why did they drown in the flood? You see, all flesh was corrupted according to Genesis 6, verse 12. So this idea of the Sethite view, as it's called, if you start examining it from a textual basis, falls apart. Makes no sense. Now, the inferred godliness of Seth is suspect because who was his son? Remember, see, only Enoch and Noah's 8 were spared. Noah and his 3 sons, that's 4 people, and their 4 wives. 8 people in that ark. Enoch's pulled out ahead of time. Those 8 are miraculously preserved in the ark. Well, where are the Sethites if they're such good guys? Remember, the Nephilim took wives as they chose. And why did the Sethites perish in the flood? And by the way, something else you may recall from last session, Enosh, which was Seth's son, is the guy that initiated the defiance of God. He's the first apostate. That last verse in chapter 4 is mistranslated. In the days of Enosh, men began to call upon the name of the Lord. That's mistranslated. They began to defy, call upon idols and so forth. Very important translation issue we talked about last time. Men began to profane the name of the Lord, according in Genesis 4:26. That's the Targum of Angelos, which is in the Jewish community regarded as the translation. The Targum of Jonathan. Kimchi, Rashi, and the other rabbinical scholars all agree. Jerome agrees. Maimonides, which is probably the most venerated of the Hebrew sages of the 12th century, in his commentary on the Mishnah. The point is, the ancient Hebrew sages understood the angel view. That's the main point I'm getting here. And daughters of Cain is the concept. There's not a subset of the daughters of Adam. Cainites were not necessarily godly. Cain, yes, he murdered his brother, but remember how that chapter ends with his genealogy. He names his son with the name of God in it. He was a repentant believer. Yes, he did murder, and yes, he's suffering for it, but his children were God-fearing, apparently, at least some of them. And the other question about the daughters of Seth that they don't have an answer for, were the daughters of Seth so unattractive? Why are the Sethite leadership going after daughters of Cain? What's wrong with the daughters of Seth? Are they ugly, or what's the problem? Anyway, but the unnatural offspring is the final nail in the coffin of the Sethite thing, the supernatural offering. The text implies that the offering, the Nephilim, were the mighty men, the Hagabarim. And to give you an example of one is Goliath. He was a descendant of Anak. Anak was one of the Nephilim. And then, of course, this whole issue of no chromosomes among the Sethites. There were no women of renown, men of renown, right? No women of renown. And so and then the other question is, what made Noah's genealogy so distinctive that it gets a mention in verse 9? Because it was unblemished. These others were blemished. Now, the New Testament, as I point out, confirms this 3 times. In Jude 6 and 7, we looked at that. 1 Peter 3, 19 and 20, and 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. So we went through those. Now, the angel view before Christ is all through the traditional rabbinical literature. It's in the book of Enoch, as I mentioned before. It's the testimony of the 12 patriarchs. It's in Josephus. Josephus talks, he takes for granted the angel view in his writings. And the Septuagint, as I mentioned. So if you look at the record that we would regard as useful, it clearly knows no other view than really the angel view. The church fathers in the early church, Philo of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Athenagoras, Tertullian, Lactantius, and Ambrose is missing. It should be Ambrose. And Julian. Let's talk about modern day. If you read the writings of G.H. Pember, M.R.D. Hahn, C.H. McIntosh, Delitzsch, Kyle and Delitzsch are the authoritative commentaries in the Old Testament in most seminary libraries. Gaebelein, Arthur W. Pink, Donald Gray Barnhouse, Henry Morris down in San Diego, Merrill Unger, expert on demonology, Arnold Fruchtenbaum, one of the greatest contemporary Jewish scholars knows his Bible, and Hal Lindsey, Chuck Smith. I had a guy that didn't really buy this, a good friend of mine, is a guy by the name of Tim LaHaye. And Tim and I used to have some discussions, and he wouldn't fight me on it. He just couldn't quite. I got a letter from him just a couple of days ago. The subject of the letter was some other things congratulating us on the verdict that we got in the trial. But he also, in a letter, says, Chuck, you finally convinced me. Because he's apparently, for some other reasons, he's doing some research and some writing, and he's got all our tapes. He's gone through them 3 times. And he finally, in his letter, he says, you finally convinced me on the angels of Genesis 6. And so I could add his name here too, I suppose. But anyway. So the Sethite view is shattered by the text itself, by the inferred separation, by the inferred godliness of Sethites, the inferred Cainite subset of the Adamites, the unnatural offspring called Nephilim, New Testament confirmations. But here is the real shocker to me. Up till now, that was my view. But as I've been doing some homework in recent years, I also realized you will not understand what happened after the flood and most of the prophecies through the Old Testament unless you understand this background. If you miss this, so I always felt, well, okay, there's 2 different views. I hold this one, they hold that one, who cares, let's go on. I discovered, no, this turns out to be important foundation to understand the rest of the Old Testament. Because you're going to run into, in the Old Testament, a term called the Rephaim. The word Repha means dead. It also means, it can mean ghost or spirit. But it's often, the Rephaim are the dead ones. But see, they're the walking dead, you'll discover. In Genesis 6:4, when we talked about the Nephilim, it says, and also after that. After the flood, we run into people called the Rephaim. After the flood, it says also after that, we discover, you'll be introduced in Genesis 14, there's at least 4 tribes. The Rephaim, the Emim, the Horim, and the Zamzumim. That God instructs Joshua to wipe out every man, woman, and child of those certain tribes. When you read that in the Old Testament, as a New Testament reader, it's hard to relate to that. Because they are instructed not to compromise, to wipe out every man, woman, child. And you need to understand, you won't understand that unless you realize there's a gene pool problem. When we get to Genesis 15, God is going to give Abraham, Genesis 12, 15, and 17, deals with God's covenant with Abraham, where he commits the land to Abraham. And he tells Abraham what's going to happen. You're going to go away, and your descendants will come back here after 400 years. He goes through that prophecy. Well, when God tells Abraham that, Satan suddenly knows that he's got 4 centuries to lay down a minefield. And so the mischief that led to the flood of Noah, that was worldwide, which was taken care of by the flood, that same mischief apparently was indulged in the land of Canaan to provide these giants to prevent Israel from taking its possession. Satan has always tried to oppose God's plan, and he gave that land to Israel. So in those days, he had these giants. Today, he's got the PLO and the UN. But let's move on.